yeah, Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. Not, of course, actually anything to do with Newcastle, and neither is her husband, the Duke of Newcastle, but and she's a really interesting, amazing figure, the first Duchess of Newcastle, around in the 1660s. And on this day, in 1667, she visited the Royal Society in London. And she was the first woman ever invited to go to the Royal Society because, you know, it hadn't been around, only been around for 10 years or so. And it was very much a men's club of natural philosophers, experimental scientists. And they come up with, they do all sorts of really, really crazy experiments, and all of the big names of the time are involved in it. But it is absolutely a man's club. In fact, the first woman to actually become a member wasn't until 1940. But Margaret Cavendish was the first woman to visit. And she was presumably allowed in because she'd written several books on natural philosophy. And she'd also, at that point, written something called The Blazing World, which is perhaps what geeks know her best for, because The Blazing World is arguably one of the world's first science fiction novels, in that it is set in a completely different world that is reached via the North Pole, and it lets her write this sort of big, complicated story it's a satire and an allegory, and lets her talk about things she wouldn't normally be able to talk about. But it is also a romance and an adventure story, and it is a piece of science fiction. So she deserves a place on the map for that. But she was also an actual scientist. She wrote several books on it, and The Blazing World was published as a companion piece to her Observations on Experimental Philosophy. And one of the things about that is she is very much in favour of women's ability to learn. She says that she expects that readers will say that writing so prolifically is a disease, and if so, it's a great honour to share that disease with so many wise and eloquent men. And she says, you know, women's wit is equal to men, it's just they don't get the opportunity for so much learning, and therefore they end up less learned, which of course makes perfect sense to us now. Wit is natural, she says, but learning is artificial. And yeah, she had some different ideas from some of these blokes. She wasn't entirely convinced about the merits of things like microscopy to find out very much. We know about her visit from Pepys, the marvellous Pepys and his diaries, who was there at the time, as he was at everything important in London for that period. And you might hope that he would talk about science in this bit. Not at all. Instead, we get in his diary that he thought her a good, comely woman, but her dress was so antic and her deportment so ordinary that I do not like her at all. Several fine experiments were shown of colours, lodestones, microscopes, and of liquors, among others, of one that did, while she was there, turn a piece of roasted mutton into pure blood, which was very rare. But I did not hear her say anything that was worth hearing, but that she was full of admiration, all admiration. Of course, she was probably just trying to be really polite because she'd been invited into this, you know, male sanctuary, and she was, oh, I admire the work you're doing. Didn't want to stir up controversy, but, you know, Pepys just wanted to comment on her antic clothing. I do want to know what a 17th century antic dress looks like, but sadly he does not record that. At another date he refers to her, he says that in her husband's writings, the Duchess of Newcastle appears to be a mad, conceited, ridiculous woman. And he uses her nickname of the time, which is Mad Madge, because people thought that any woman getting involved in science must be talking nonsense and having these crazy ideas. So she dies just a few years after that, in 1673. But we can kind of pick up some of her ideas in the main person I want to talk about today by just moving forward another 10 years after that, 1683, and the birth of a lady called Elizabeth Elstob. Now, Elizabeth Elstob is a proper Geordie, unlike the Duchess of Newcastle, and she is born down on the quayside. Her father is a quayside merchant. At that time, he's actually Sheriff of Newcastle, so it's quite an important family. But he dies when she's 8, and her mother dies. Well, her mother raises her and the 7 other children for the next 4 years as a widow, manages to teach Elizabeth the basics of Latin and French while raising 8 children, and then she dies as well. And Elizabeth is sent to live with her uncle in Canterbury. Now, her new guardian is rather less keen on the idea of her learning. She was always told no, and she was given the common saying that one tongue is enough for any woman. Now, as a non-linguist, I'm quite happy that one tongue is enough for me, but nonetheless, we got a bit of a problem there. Eventually, he allowed his wife to carry on her French studies a little bit, but that was as far as he was willing to go. Fortunately, her eldest brother, William, who's full 10 years older, he has gone to Oxford and then he's entered the priesthood, and he's very supportive of her learning. And they would visit each other and he would pass books on to her and that sort of thing. And at 19, she moves to London to become his housekeeper. And that means she can get properly stuck into the scholarship. And she meets this group of great intellectual women. And most of them are gentry, but actually they're by a weird coincidence, they are centred around a lady called Mary Astle, who's the first major feminist writer in English. Mary Astle is another Geordie, by complete fluke. She was also born on the quayside, just, 17 years earlier, and has a similar life with becoming an orphan at 12, and then her previously supportive education dries up and she ends up moving to London in her late teens and becomes a sort of academic. And she instead gets the patronage of the Archbishop of Canterbury to be able to keep going. And she also has this argument that women, and it's shocking to think at the time, can be as rational and intellectually capable as a man. Just imagine. And she couldn't imagine how women would be content to just make a fine show of themselves like a tulip in a garden, and wants to start an all-female college, which is a very early idea. That doesn't actually happen in this country for hundreds of years after that. So Elizabeth Elstob finds this group of women, and she's got the support of her brother and of various other scholars that are working with her brother on various linguistic stuff. Within a few years, she's learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and German, as you do. And she's the first woman in the modern era that we know of to learn Old English. It's why she's remembered as the Saxon Nymph. And I'm not entirely sure whether that's intended as a compliment or whether it's putting her down by calling her a nymph, but that's what we've got. And she's definitely the first woman to write any scholarship of the time. And she says, "I found it so easy to learn Anglo-Saxon, and in it so much of the grounds of our present language, and a more particular agreement with some words which I heard when I was very young in the north." So she's saying that knowing Geordie dialect has helped her to learn Old English, which of course makes perfect sense, because back then, Geordie dialect was a lot stronger back then. There were a lot more words in use that were non-standard English words. And in any case, it is true that a lot of words in Geordie do come from there. So let's digress a little bit and look at that. It is said now that about a third of standard English words are based on Anglo-Saxon words, about a third. But if you look at Geordie dialect words, about 80% of them come from Saxon. It's widely thought that they come from the Viking, and it's because we had connections with the Vikings back in times past. So that's not actually true. If you want Viking influence in your dialect, you have to go to places like Yorkshire, places with all those B place names, Grimsby and Whitby and all of that. Up here, we actually have more connection with the Old English words that have survived through somehow. So if someone says "I'll learn you" for "I'll teach you," the likes of me would be going, "No, you won't learn me. You'll teach me." That's the opposite of learning me. But "learn" is the Old English for "to teach." So it's perfectly acceptable. A hoppings is a fair. That's why we have the hoppings, and I'm pointing at it that way. A lot of things we think of as just being a dialect variant, like calling a cow a coo. Well, that's Old English. That's the correct pronunciation for cow in Old English. So the reason it feels like it's connected to Viking words is because Norse words that have survived, Norwegian words that have survived are quite similar, but that's just because they both go back to this sort of Anglo-Saxon starting point. So Elizabeth Elstob's in a position to learn all of these things. She, the first thing she does, 1709, translates Elfric's homily on the birthday of St Gregory, which is not a terribly exciting translation of a terribly exciting work in and of itself. But she writes an introduction, which is actually quite a lot longer than the translation itself. And it's a 60-page argument of religion and politics, which argues primarily against slavery and in favour of the right of a woman to an education. And she says, if women may be said to have souls, good learning be one of the soul's great improvements, what is the fault in women seeking after learning? Fairly straightforward, right? She has critics, of course. Thomas Hearne says that it's a farrago of vanities. And he also says that it must really be written by her brother, because, of course, women aren't capable of doing that sort of writing. This idea of women not doing their own writing, but it being the men really doing it, goes way back and forward. It was happening in the Anglo-Saxon times and continued on happening. As a complete little aside, Thomas Boulder, as in to boulderize a work. To boulderize something means to sort of sanitize a written work by taking out all the rude bits. And Thomas Boulder allegedly did this with Shakespeare in 1818. Fact is, his sister Henrietta did most of it, but of course he took all the credit because otherwise she would have had to admit that she had read all the rude bits, understood what they were in order to be able to change them, and that would never do in polite society. So in that case, it's actually whether Thomas is doing it to do her a favour or whether he just wants to take the credit, there is actually a good reason for it. So yes, clearly she couldn't have written it herself. She keeps on working. 6 years later, we get to the Rudiments of Grammar for the English Tongue, which is the first ever Old English grammar that explains it in English rather than in Latin. The idea being that it would then be accessible to other people, including women. And the President Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of that book. And that gives me an excuse to briefly digress into Anglo-Saxon grammar, which is a nightmare. Grammar, to me, grammar is etymologically related to glamour in the sense of magic. So there used to be the word magic, glamour, which has extended one way to make something being glamorous, but also extended to the word grammar. Because as far as I'm concerned, understanding grammar is basically magic. It's all just horrible. But grammar is very, very complicated. If you look at the grammar, let's say one crazy example, which is word endings of plurals. We usually just add an S to the vast majority of things. There are exceptions, of course, mouse, mice, but there are not many. They have loads and loads of different options depending on all sorts of things. Some things, yes, get an S. The plural of house to an Anglo-Saxon is house. The plural of goat is gat. The plural of book is beak. The plural of lamb is lamru. You see, it's adding something completely different on each of those. It's not consistent in its weirdness. There's a whole class that gain en on the end, like tungen and iron. Now, test for you. And what are the 3 English words that survive, which have survived since the Old English, which still have an en plural ending? It gets very, very complicated. One thing I think we could usefully bring back is that the Old English has 3 different kinds of you. It has a different word for you, not just, it kind of makes sense to have, like the French do, a singular you and a plural you. Old English has 3 kinds of you. You as in just one of you as in 2 of you, and you as in more than 2 of you. So, yeah, you can imagine there are times where, I'm inviting you to a party. You would then know whether that was inviting 1 of you, 2 of you, or all of you to the party without having to actually explain it. Quite useful, right? So, Elizabeth publishes that particular one. So, she's published that, she's working on her next thing, and then disaster strikes. Her brother dies. Her brother has been ill for many years. It's thought that going to London's probably not helped his health because he's got consumption. And she's 32. He dies. Her main mentor dies shortly afterwards. And there's huge debts, mostly from medical bills, which helped keep her alive. Well, she wasn't that well either, but mostly kept him alive. She'd also managed to get herself the patronage of Queen Anne herself, which is the one played by Olivia Colman, if that helps you sort of place this whole setting in time. But then she dies as well, before the grant can actually be received. And because this isn't just one king passing or one queen passing to another king, it's a whole regime change. Having been in with the old queen is really not good news for the chance of getting any money out of anyone. So that whole source of funding dries up. She is in a really bad way. So she tries briefly to run a girls' school in Chelsea, presumably because that's exactly what her original friend Mary Astle had done when she retired 6 years before. But she realises she's going to have to basically flee and go into hiding and live a whole different life. And for 17 years, we don't really know what happened to her. She is living, apparently, under the assumed name Frances Smith in a small poor dame school in Evesham. And as far as we know, none of her old friends had a clue where she was. And when she is finally recognised, it's described that she was the lowness of her spirits and tenderness of her constitution require many indulgences which a small circumstance will not all allow of. She has no servant to give her the least assistance and has no more than the base supports of life. The only thing she says about it is that she was out of reach of any manuscripts. Clearly that's the worst thing that can possibly happen to you, is to be out of reach of any manuscripts. Eventually she does get a circle of friends who help her a little. They try to get her a teaching job, but she points out that she has no idea how to weave or spin, which are important things to be able to teach in any girls' school, and therefore no school is going to appoint her. And it turns out she's right. One school turns her down, saying that if only she was able to teach artificial flowers and tapestry, she'd have had more chance. But eventually she becomes a governess in the house of the Duke and Duchess of Portland for the last 23 years of her life. One of her students in that time later becomes a Prime Minister, William Cavendish Bentinck, who becomes Prime Minister twice with 24 years between the two times, which is kind of impressive in itself. And she dies on this year in 1756, which takes us back to things to do with the date. 72 years old and feeling the weight very much of how society has limited her. She says, "This is not an age to hope for any encouragement to learning of any kind." But I prefer to think of the other thing that is said of her last days, which is that she died surrounded by the congenial elements of dirt and her books. I'll leave it to you to work out why that image appeals to me. And finally, looking at things that happened on that date, we can say that in 1848, William G. Young patented an improved ice cream maker, which I'm sure is something we could all enjoy right now. And it may even help to connect that together, as Elizabeth Elstob could have told you. We are now at the very end of the Anglo-Saxon month of Trimiltia, which is literally the three milkings, because this is the time when the fresh grass is so good that you can milk your cows 3 times a day, and that will give you lots and lots of milk for making your ice cream. And we know about that because Bede wrote it in his Reckoning of Time, and he also died this week. Not quite today, a couple of days ago, close enough. So that ties us right back up, all these things happening today and all those different times through history, which is why history is awesome. And let's see. Weirdly, you've got the less common ones, unless I've missed the easy one going up. So brethren, yes, oxen, and children are the 3 words that survive, that etymologically are Anglo-Saxon weird endings for for that. So yeah, thank you very much for all staying and listening to me wittering. I hope you all look after yourselves, and I will give you all a big hug when I see you next. Okay, bye bye.